What are you making?
Okay, so here we are, and we're gonna make some fresh pasta today. And the reason I want to do this is because most people think that this is really hard, and I want to show people how easy it can actually be. So you really only need a handful of things to be able to do this. So one is a clean surface. Now if you look at this surface, it doesn't look very clean. It looks like it has flour all over it, but that's okay because I just put it there. Okay, so there's only really a handful of ingredients that you need for fresh pasta, and that's flour, salt, some eggs, and a little bit of olive oil, and I'll kind of explain that here in a minute. So when you have the flour, the first thing that you want to do is sift it. Okay, and the reason we sift this flour is because when we use it, we don't want to have any big clumps or anything in the flour. So you can actually see there's some crusty pieces that are left in the colander there, and the reason is that's the reason that we sift it. Okay, so we have our flour here, and we're going to lightly salt it. Right now, you put salt on the flour, and it's just supposed to be a pinch. Now, the amount of salt that you put in the flour right now isn't really important, because when we actually cook this pasta, the pasta water that we cook it in is going to be salted like the ocean. So that's what's going to give you the flavor in the pasta. So I wouldn't be so worried about how much salt you put in the flour right now, but that's the reason. Now, this is a double time batch of what we did probably last time we did this, and we're feeding a lot of people today, and that's the reason. So this is 4 cups of flour instead of 2. Okay, so we have our salted flour here. Now here's what we do with that. We have the eggs, and we're making kind of a moat to kind of put the eggs in there, and they're going to house the eggs before we mix them up. Now we have 4 eggs instead of 2 eggs, because again, this is a double time batch. And then we have 12 instead of 6 egg yolks, okay? And I left a couple of the egg yolks in the whites here because I just wanted to show you. An old chef on TV told me once that the easiest or the best tools that you have in the kitchen are your hands. You just want to make sure that your hands are clean, okay? So instead of doing the whole separate the yolk from the shell thing with all of the eggs, it's easier just to kind of pull them out with your hands and separate them from the yolks, okay? Now, as you can see, in my egg whites, I have one of the yolks that broke, so it's still slightly orange. Now, the egg whites, you could use those later on for breakfast in the morning. You can make an omelet with egg whites and put anything in it. But for this application, we're done with those. So we're just gonna kind of set those aside. We don't need the egg whites. If we put them in the refrigerator, then they'll be good for tomorrow morning. Okay, so here we go. We're going to put the eggs in here. Now you can mix these eggs ahead of time. Totally can. It's not a big deal. Most people just put them in there like that because we're going to mix them in a second. Now the last ingredient is olive oil. The olive oil does a couple of things. Adds fat to the actual recipe, and the fat helps mix the dough when we need it a little bit easier. It prevents it from sticking, and just helps for the texture, overall texture of the dough. So we're going to add that in there also at the same time. All right, here we go. So we're going to start mixing the eggs here, and then what we'll do is slowly. Now you might get a little runaway egg here now and again, and that's okay, but you want to try to not make a complete mess like I'm doing. So if this happens to you, you're just gonna have to ditch the fork and then bring your dough scraper in, okay, the big guns. And when we start that, we're just gonna kind of mix this stuff on the counter. There we go. And then here in a minute, what we're gonna do is end up with a dough ball. Okay, now the dough ball, we're going to knead. Now this is probably as hard as it gets right here. So if you're able to do this, then you're probably in good shape. So, down here, got the kids crying in the background. We are at home. And here we go. So once you get to a point where you can kind of work the dough, which we're almost there, and then we'll be able to mix it here. There we go, we're almost there. And what I'm doing is just doing this a little bit longer with the dough scraper because I'm trying to preserve my fingers here in a minute because this is gonna make a little bit of a mess. Here we go. So, oops, try not to spill your salt. Okay, so we're just gonna start to kind of fold the dough, and then as you can see, I'm kind of doing it in a kneading motion. Now, I'm making a little bit of a mess with my hands at the moment, but you'll see here in a minute it's gonna come together. Now, as you can see, the dough here is a little yellow, okay? Now that's why we use egg yolks along with the whole eggs for part of this reason. Now, the dough is really yellow, and it adds the extra yolks that are in there, add richness and flavor to the dough, along with making it yellow, so it looks like yellow pasta. Okay, now from here, we're almost there. So from here, we got almost what our dough ball is gonna look like. Now as you go and start to knead this, what's gonna happen is, it's either gonna get dry on you, or it's gonna be really wet and sticky. Now, if it's really wet and sticky, you just add a little bit of flour to it from our pile over here, which is extra flour. And then if it gets dry on you, we're just gonna sprinkle a little bit of water in there and kind of moisten it up a little bit, right? Because we want the texture to be right. Now, if we have too much water, your pasta is gonna be really mushy. You don't want mushy. So if it's dry, then the texture's not gonna be right either. So
how do you know if it's dry or like?
Well, I'm gonna try to see if I can't give you an example here. As we go a little further, what we're doing as we're kneading the dough is we're activating the yeast, okay? Now, I'm sorry, there's no yeast in here. We're activating the gluten. And gluten is a good thing. It has to be a good thing because when it's in pasta, the gluten is what gives you your texture, right? And that's why when you have gluten-free pasta, the texture is not as great as it is with pasta with gluten in it. So here in a minute, once we get the pasta or this dough ball all rolled out, I'll show you what that looks like. Then we're gonna knead this thing for about, 7 to 10 minutes. And about a minute and a half ago, I looked at the clock, trust me, because this is not an easy task, but it's not that difficult. This is, like I said, the hardest part about it. So if you can kind of see what I'm doing with my hands here, all I'm doing is kind of folding and pushing, folding and pushing. And then we just do this over and over again. And I don't want to bore you with the details. Maybe we can come right back after we knead this guy for a few minutes. All right, so here we are, almost at the 10-minute mark, and we got this guy. I'm just gonna kind of make a ball here. Now at this point, you should have like a firm Play-Doh. All right, that's what you're looking for. So we're gonna set that there, and how you know you're in good shape is when you press on it and it bounces back. You see that? So that's how you know the gluten's pretty activated right now. So here's what we have to do. We have to cover this guy for 10 minutes. I'm sorry, not 10 minutes, 30 minutes. And we want to cover it just to keep the air off of it so it doesn't get dry and crusty. Okay, so we're gonna let it sit there on the counter and see you in 30 minutes. All right, so it's been 30 minutes. It's actually been a little over 30 minutes, and this gluten is hopefully nice and relaxed. So I'm just going to show you what we're going to do here. We're going to kind of flatten it out just a little bit just to help us along. Now, this is actually the fun part. During this part, usually people have the fancy little pasta machine where you roll the pasta through the machine 2 or 3 times, depending on how thin you want it. We don't have one of those machines here. Nothing wrong with those machines. Those machines are great. We just don't have one. So I'm going to show you how to do this by hand, okay? And still have great pasta while you do that. So we have extra flour over here. At the same time, we have our dough over here. So as we roll it back out, the moisture that's inside the dough is going to release out onto the counter, and it's going to make it a little bit sticky. So when that happens, we've got flour to be able to counteract that moisture. So we're just going to kind of roll this out, and when we do that, we're going to try to, or attempt to, get this as thin as possible. Okay, so it's not going to take as long as you think, and while you're doing this, nothing wrong with kind of moving it around, getting the flour on there, just to keep it from sticking to the table, sticking to your board. And then we're going to roll this out. It takes a little bit of work, but what we want to do is we want to eventually get to the point where it's thin. What they say is, who's they, right? What they say is that you want to try to get the dough to where you can read through it, right? Thin enough to where if you have your fingers on this side, this is obviously not thin enough yet, but I want to show you what to look for. All right, so we're getting close, and we're going to roll, keep rolling. I kind of may have bit off more than I could chew here, so I cut kind of a big piece off of there. So we're just going to cut this in half and see if that's helpful. So I want to show you 2 different kinds of pasta here. One is the pappardelle. Now it's pronounced a couple of different ways, depending on who you are. I've heard pappardelle, I've heard pappardelle, but what that is, really is a wide egg noodle. Okay, and so what it's gonna look like, it's gonna resemble fettuccine. Some people use it as a substitute for fettuccine. Now you can see here, as we're getting flatter, if you can get the camera right there, you can kind of see the marble through the pasta. Can you guys see that a little bit? That's kind of close to what we're looking for. Now, I wouldn't worry too much about getting this thing real thin, because we want a little bit of a hearty pasta. So, we're gonna call this finished for now for demonstration purposes. Now, it's a little sticky because of, like we said, the moisture inside. If that happens, try not to use a ton of flour, but kind of get it workable again. Now, I'm going to show you 2 different pastas. This one is the pappardelle. That's what we're going to do first. Kind of fold it, kind of roll it. Now, you could get, some people trim off the ends and then discard those. I'm not really interested in discarding them, because what we have here is fresh rolled pasta, and you want it to look freshly rolled. You don't want it to look manufactured. So some of your imperfect pieces are going to be just fine in somebody's bowl of pasta. So I wouldn't worry too much about those. But what we're going to do is just kind of make strips just like that. You see that? Now, anybody who's a knife owner and is really proud of their knives may get really irritated about me cutting right on the marble here, but I'm not using a lot of pressure, so I'm not going to dull my knife. Now, we're just going to kind of like unroll these guys right here. Now, this is the point where we want them to dry out a little bit before we actually put them in the water. Some people put them on one of those pasta drying racks. We don't necessarily need one of those, because if we're going to cook it right away, you don't need to put it on the rack. If we're going to preserve it for later, really what we're going to do is just set it right here, give it a little twist, and make a little pile right there. See that? And now if you want to put that in the freezer and use it for a rainy day, you could totally do that. And it stays great just like that. Now, you do that over and over and over again until you have lots of those pastas. But I want to show you, since I have this thing rolled out, why not, right? Show you guys if you wanted to make another pasta, for instance, let's say bow tie pasta, right? Who doesn't like bow tie pasta? So if you were to cut this in strips, just like that, right? In some cases, you can, but you don't have to. So depending on how big you want to make those, like these guys, just like that, we can ruffle the ends just like that. And then what you're going to do is you're going to put this finger right in the middle and take your thumb and your middle finger and just squeeze. There you go. There's one. You don't have to make the ruffles. If you're a man and you don't want them quite as frilly, there you go. There's the other version. But they're really easy to make. Get your kids involved. You can get your friends sitting around drinking wine involved. Then you can make a bunch of these bow ties, and then eventually you're going to have a bowl, right? So there's the demonstration on that. But for these purposes, we're going to eat tonight, and we're going to use the pappardelle. So I'm going to roll these out and not bore you through the rest of it, but that's how we actually do it, and then we'll show you the finished product. So we're finishing up here. We've got Stella in the video here, my little helper. Good pasta roller. Thank you, Stella. And some of these are a little thicker than others, but the point I wanted to make was this being fresh pasta is really only going to take about 2 minutes to cook. It's not your typical 7 or 8 minutes like dried pasta does. Now, the important thing about this is, like we talked about earlier, you don't want it to be too wet because it's going to take on some water, okay? So we have some dropping on the floor, but as we go into the pot needs to be boiling salted water. Like we talked about, salted like the ocean. You can see I'm kind of breaking it up here as I'm putting it in. Now the important thing is that it's boiling, because if the water's not boiling and you cook the pasta and the pasta's done, it's going to be gummy. And it gets gummy because the water's not hot enough to absorb in there, okay? So this is kind of recover here in a second and come back to a boil. It's going to take on some water and it's going to swell. And we'll send you a picture of the finished product.